My name's Cecilia, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm going to be speaking to you today a little bit about community mapping and what sponsors can be doing to help develop housing in your area that's sustainable and affordable. Okay. So what is community mapping? Ultimately, community mapping is a collaborative tool used to identify and visualize local resources, gaps, opportunities, anything that's specific to the community and the community's needs. Think of it kind of like a digital bulletin board or some kind of collaborative tool made by the community for a specific issue that's important. It's not necessarily just about sharing knowledge about rental units. It's also about sharing knowledge about, where an important transit center may be, a shopping center or something, where affordable clothing centers are, stuff like that. That's like important for resettlement and can be shared across the board. Different kinds of newcomer services, stuff like that. An important piece of it is identifying gaps and strengths in local neighborhoods. A neighborhood for a sponsorship group that lives out in one suburb might not be ideal for another one that doesn't live there, So a lot of times, I'll get into it in a minute, but my research identified that a lot of sponsors said that, sometimes housing was so unavailable to them because it was so far away, they couldn't provide the support that they wanted to because of that distance. So identifying, what and sharing that knowledge helps everybody, right? So, if one rental unit doesn't work for one group, it might work for another. So yes, just about building those kind of community supports and developing a structure around that. A little bit about my research background here. So I focused on my master's. It was about housing, but more specifically, it kind of focused on sponsorship as like a volunteered centered social service within kind of, the structure of social services within Canada. But I did focus on housing and kind of used housing when I interviewed private sponsors as a lens to identify what kind of strengths they found, what kind of gaps, where the issues were, and how people overcame a lot of the troubles that they were seeing. Because, as we all know, housing is really important and it's very difficult, just personally finding housing in Ottawa, and I'm sure everywhere else in Ontario is very similar. Like it's a struggle, right? So next slide here. So some of the things that sponsors identified as strategies that they use to find housing, most commonly was something they called soft landings, which I'm sure a lot of you know of, that essentially where a volunteer in this sponsors organization would allow the sponsorship group to live with them for a temporary amount of time until they were able to find more permanent accommodations. This was like a volunteer within the main organization, or like if it was a faith-based group, it was maybe somebody in the wider church or something like that. But sometimes they also defined it as people finding a temporary Airbnb or a motel or something like that, where they would live temporarily. An equal amount of people found housing before the newcomers came and were family link cases. So a lot of the time, they kind of just signed leases when they found a place that was ideal and affordable and within a great location for them. So they just kind of went for it and at their own financial risk. But, sometimes it worked out and sometimes it didn't. We'll get into that in a second. And an equal amount were family link cases where the newcomer's family either sponsored previously or immigrated or, were just born here, lived here already, and they came to live with them first. And then while kind of the sponsorship and family, while the family and the sponsorship group found housing for them collectively. And a small amount of people also found housing before the arrival of the newcomer family, but were able to actually contact them and show them viewings and kind of decide for a place to live together. But that was really rare and actually only happened in one of the cases, because for the most part, people just kind of had to roll with the punches, as they say. So some quotes here about what people were actually saying about what worked and what didn't work, and what kind of tools and things that helped them along the way. Ultimately, what worked the best and what a lot of my research concluded was that networking was paramount in everything. The more kind of knowledge was shared, the easier things went. You know, a lot of people said like they went to a workshop and found somebody to speak to, and then that person gave them a number for a landlord and they found housing that way. Or yeah, you know, we'll speak about it, I'm sure, in the next presentation about a real estate agent being in their group, lucky enough, right? So things like that that really helped people along in the sponsorship process was really those networks to build. Challenges, one of the biggest things, price. Obviously, I think we all know how much housing increased in kind of that late 2000 to now period. You know, it's getting to the point where a lot of people were putting themselves, feeling like they were putting themselves more at the kind of at risk financially, or putting themselves in a position they weren't necessarily comfortable with initially when they went into sponsorship. But they kind of did that anyways because it was, you know, as maybe a last resort or something that they felt like they kind of needed to do. And yeah, the budgets just kept increasing, but all the while they still found ways to kind of overcome those challenges. Ultimately, a lot of the tools that they used, educating landlords, a lot of the time, you know, they would have a letter of support or something like that. One sponsorship group in particular actually had a pamphlet kind of booklet ready for private landlords who've maybe never rented to newcomers before. And, you know, it was one person's responsibility to create this little like give out kind of handout for people that just explained that, you know, they would have the rent, they would have these kinds of supports, and you know, just kind of basic education for the landlord on what private sponsorship is as well. They ultimately also really relied on networks and just tried to speak to one another about, you know, who had what resources and what kind of knowledge was shared. Luckily too, some people in the group, the larger groups especially, had some people who were retired and weren't working, you know, 9 to 5 jobs, and were able to actually go to the viewings during the day or have a meeting at 11 a.m. without any kind of issue, you know. So there were some people in one group that would search for the housing, do the kind of online work on Kijiji and PadMapper and Facebook, and then the other people would actually go to the viewings and talk to the landlords and be able to kind of create those relationships through assigning those roles. Right. So ultimately, networking is really the kind of base, you know, like I said before, it really, that was what I think my research concluded, was that networking was by far and away the most important aspect about creating reliable housing. And it's partly what we're doing here, which is great. Social media and online searches. So like I said before, you know, the market's really changing in terms of how people are finding housing. Just, you know, on a personal level, all of the best apartment deals I've ever found have been on Kijiji under this, you know, really sketchy ad almost that is, you know, may not look the best or may be hard to find, but it takes a lot of like sifting through weird postings to find something that actually exists and actually works, you know. So having those kinds of people that are able to do those searches while also having a resource to go to viewings and speak to landlords was a huge value to a lot of the sponsorship groups that I spoke to. Ultimately, on that point too, with larger corporations and smaller landlords, an important consideration for a lot of people was, you know, if we approach the Mintos and the big property owners, although they do have, you know, often like standardized processes, you know, and have dealt with these sponsorship groups before, have rented to newcomers in this way, but don't really have a lot of flexibility with their rental prices, or, you know, different apartment buildings around town, but those private landlords were able to kind of give you a deal or take a month's off rent or be able to provide you a support that a larger corporation wouldn't be able to offer necessarily. So it's, again, having those kinds of larger connections there, meeting regularly, something just like we're doing exactly, you know, renting and being able to provide, share knowledge is an important step. Sharing documents. I'm going to get into an example next of what a map actually might look like. But ultimately, you know, a map doesn't have to be a map. It can just be a shared Google document or something that is collaborative and accessible to everybody, really is what it is. It doesn't necessarily like have to be visualized through a map. assigning internal roles. Like I said before, you know, having one person do the online searches versus another going out and viewing apartments, and another creating pamphlets. Like it's about making sure there's a sustainable role assignment as well. And monitor and mentoring smaller groups as well. You know, one group in particular literally said it was their first time, and they went to a meeting similar to this and found a group that has done this before a million times and was able to provide them with a reliable lead to housing. So a little bit here on the example. So this is just kind of what a community map might look like. This was pretty easy to make. I made it through Google. I don't have a full explanation on how it's made right now, but I can definitely create that kind of document to share around with people. It's very straightforward. It's free because it's all done through Google Sheets and Google Docs. I also think it can be done in any language because it is through a Google interface. So I'm sure, you know, if it probably auto translates too, I'm sure in some ways. So I can show how, you know, this is made in a later date. But this is kind of something that, you know, a community map might look like. It might not just be, you know, landlords, it might be where a settlement agency is, where a service is, where things like that, you know. And this obviously, I think it has to be a little city specific, because a map in Ottawa is not really going to work for a map in Hamilton. But at the same time, you know, a connection in Ottawa or like an example from Ottawa might really help a different city create that same map, right? So I think it's still important to share amongst groups, and although create kind of local resources, but share amongst larger resources as well. A point here just about sharing resources, although yes, it's very important, it's something that I think a lot of people do need to take into consideration, of just making sure that you have people's consent to share their contacts. You know, it's great that somebody got a contact from a resource in Minto who has done all this work before and is ready to rent to newcomers. But if that person doesn't want their information blasted on online, then they should probably, you have to have that conversation with them, right? Like, this is something that, yes, it's very collaborative and can work, but it also needs to be made sure that like people are consenting to this, because it can lead to a, you know, a pretty messy road down the line. And again, this is something too that just needs to be updated often. You know, unlike a lot of issues with sponsorship, you know, a language service is probably going to be in the same place for a long period of time, but a rental unit that just came up may not, you know. So again, although this is something, it's maybe, you know, putting in rental units might not be the best idea here, because yeah, it's those change so quickly, but you know, still being able to put in a landlord who has a lot of rental units that does have experience with this before and can maybe refer you to someone else or something like that is important. So, you know, I think designating somebody to take this on and making sure that they it's updated in a reliable and sustainable way is very important.
Cecilia, just giving you a 5-minute warning.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm almost done. Okay, great. Um, so yeah, just, you know, start small. Again, this doesn't have to be something that is done overnight. It's really first about collecting those resources, collecting those addresses that you need to be able to say where's everything that's important, and just going from there. Testing, making sure that, you know, a map might not be for you. Honestly, like if a map doesn't work, then a Google Doc will work, or a Google Excel or something like that. You know, it just asking those questions, is this helping? You know, what's missing? What's confusing? Sharing among different groups, and, you know, maybe offering what you've made to another group to see if that works for them, and then sharing from there, you know. And planning for the future and planning for future resources is also important with something like this. You know, ongoing access and having somebody update this, like I said, like a rental unit that goes 1 month isn't not maybe not going to be there in 4 or 5 months, you know. So somebody who's designated to update this and like have a regular kind of schedule around it is important. Teamwork and collaboration. Ultimately, this is, I think, my conclusion here. I think the more we collaborate on housing and resources that may work for one group, but doesn't work for another, is so important. You know, if something that as a sponsorship group doesn't work for you, but may work for another, that's something that needs to be shared. You know, work the problem from all angles. What's the neighborhood that's good for some that's not good for others? Is this something that's good for a map? Maybe it's not, you know, maybe a map isn't the right choice. Maybe a Google Doc is. And once that's complete, maybe just submitting it to 4 or 5 local sponsorship groups and seeing if that works for everybody, or providing feedback on different formats is very important. And again, I think safety comes first. Your own safety comes first in a lot of ways. You know, make sure that you get the consent of people who would have personal information on this shared database. You know, you can't just post people's personal stuff online for others, right? That needs to be very informed and very allowed by the person's information you're sharing, as well as, you know, you can't really help others until you help yourself, right? So it's important to just keep that in mind going forward with this kind of map.
First, David, thank you so much for changing the title on the flyer that went out that said, "Using a real estate agent, does it work?" And I thought to myself, well, I suppose the answer to that is maybe. So I'll go over a few things here about what we do, how we can help, and what our, I guess, what our benefits are. You've already covered who I am and what I do. And I've been involved in a number of leases for nonprofits in the church, and of course, helping David recently. And sometimes there's some wonderful things we can do, but there's some limitations, and I'm going to go over a few of those. First, we'll start with the basics. I am a licensed real estate agent. I help people buy and sell houses and lease as well. Involved in a lease, you're going to do some basic things. You're going to negotiate terms. You're going to provide advice, pricing, things like that. And generally, when we work with somebody, we're going to be going out and hunting down properties for it. We'll have a principal, have some things. We will go out and we'll start looking, and we will find properties. We can explain how we go through paperwork, what the leases look like, because they're typically in my world, we have a 5-page lease offer that then goes into a 14-page government lease, the Ontario Standard lease, the residential tenancy agreement. And in the meantime, we have a million different pieces of paper that are going to go back and forth. So we sort of have to get through that process through there. And I guess the big thing I want to go into is how we find available properties. This goes a lot to what Cecilia was talking about. We have to look for the appropriate things. In the real estate world, we go to the MLS. That's going to be the realtor.ca that that everyone's looking at. And to give you an idea of what the numbers are like on there, to start weaning it out. In Toronto, as of this morning, there are 19,968 available residential rentals. And I can pretty much guess that of that, maybe 2,000 are going to be available for families. And then when we find a cooperative landlord, it's going to be reduced even further. When we go into our specific map, we wind up with just a handful of places that we're going to be able to see. And that's really where we start getting the sizzle and the magic of what we're going to be able to put together on this one. We have the MLS that we're going to be looking at. I think Cecilia had said that the best places that she had seen were on Kijiji. Kijiji is a great source. Viewit.ca is another wonderful source. And then there's going to be corporate landlords the Met Caps and H&R and Dell Property Rentals that have their own specific sites as well. There's a number of places that you can go and look for this, and this would probably start off with your appropriate mapping to be able to say, these are the people that we want to go because we want to have the people in this area so they could get public transportation, or they could get a specific school or a specific job, that type of a thing. So, there's a number of places that we're going to start looking for them. And really, where the key that I would say we'd start off with was in one of Cecilia's slide. It says, we started trying to build relationships, and the relationships with the landlords and the property managers, I would probably say, is the most important part of this process. I'll give you an example. The phone calls that will be made will be things like, hi, I'm John from Remax. I'm looking at your property at 123 Happy Street. Is it available? Might as well. When do you need to have somebody in there? Because nobody wants to have a long-term vacancy in their property. And then we start looking at the profile of who we're going to move in. This becomes a bit of a challenge when you start saying, well, I'm bringing in somebody who has no Canadian credit score, no job, and in some cases, we don't have a lot of language skills on it. And most landlords at this point in time are going to start going, I don't know about this. Because when we go through the approval process, we can get no's immediately for a number of different reasons. But the obvious one would be that we can't comply with, putting in, how do we know they're going to pay the rent? These are things that become more problematic because in Ontario law right now, if somebody is a tenant and they can't pay their rent, well, the landlord's going to say, you can't pay, you've got to move out. And they can't kick them out. Essentially, it's going through the housing tribunal. And one of my landlords right now is 5 months into the process of trying to evict somebody or collect rent. So that is every landlord's biggest nightmare. So what we need to do is have somebody ready to go. And Cecilia had touched on this with how we're going to present the person. And I know David's going to continue on that. So I'm not going to go too far into that. But to say that one of the conversations that we had in the process was I phoned up and I said, we've got a family, and it's a refugee family, and they're coming in with this and this and this. And the agent said to me on the other side, this was an MLS listing. He said, it sounds interesting. Let me call you back. And he phones me back about half an hour later, and he said, I wanted permission to share the story with you. And I said, go ahead. Like, I'm thinking he's going to tell me a creative, oh, we really don't want you to bring your clients in here. He said, I wanted to let you know that the landlord was a refugee to Canada in 1986. And I came to Canada as a refugee in 1995. We totally get it. We're totally sympathetic to your cause on this one. So if you want to go ahead with this place, if the family likes it, if you got the paperwork in a row and the timing works, we're willing to work with you. And that's probably the absolute magic sauce that we could bring to the table and say, this is how we're going to be able to put this one together. Now we weren't able to do that on that because the other side of landlord nightmares is a long-term vacancy. So they were able to get somebody else in there prior to us being able to make a commitment to it. At the same time, we've seen this happen in where we thought we had a win and then we had a rejection later on. And I think Cecilia touched on that one, and I think I've got a comment on that one coming up shortly. Now, one of the other things we can do is coordinate showings. This really goes into a really nice dovetail what happened before. This is finding somebody who can go out and see properties or do video showings. It could be simple. Just show up with your phone and take a do a quick FaceTime with somebody or a quick Zoom call or something like that. Even just taking if you go to your phone, you could take a quick video, save it, and then text it off or email it off to people later on. So you can get a little more of a buy-in if there's a committee of 5, 6 people that really want to be able to take a look beforehand. If you can do that, then you've got one person coming through. Again, you could talk to the landlord or the property manager about what you're doing. Now, I'm going to I'm just going to bring something back a little bit here. And that is often if you're looking at a property with a tenant in place, it's really common courtesy to ask whether or not you can take photographs with their stuff in there. In the real estate world, we don't want to be caught taking pictures of people's stuff without having explicit permission to be able to send through, take a picture and say, this is the view and this is what the kitchen looks like. But some people may not want that one. And if you're sending it out to groups, please don't send out any pictures with people in them. Now, what real estate agents cannot do, and these are some limitations. I think it's probably some are advantages. We can't commit our client to anything. So when we go to advance somebody's position with it, here's what my clients are looking for. This is the group of people I have. We're looking for a place like this. The landlord can come back and say, well, if we could do this, this, or this, or if you could take it next Monday, we've got a deal on this one. We actually can't commit people to that. All we can do really is advance our client's position until we actually get a signature somewhere down the line. So it does create a really great blind person to be going in to start off a negotiation, because we can come up with I don't know the answer to that, or let me get back to you. So frankly, we don't answer a question terribly incorrectly in a way that would completely scuttled the deal when we find a spot. Sadly, we can't guarantee approvals for anybody's paperwork, no matter how much we take in there. And, we can't discriminate against the landlord screening process. This, on the other side, is going to be, if there's an agent on the other side, I'm going to hand them all of the paperwork. That person's going to take it to their landlord, and the landlord's got to start that. They can't start off and say, well, we don't want these people for whatever reason before they do that. And one thing we cannot do on this largely is we cannot work for free. This is like to go into that one just a little bit because I don't want to make it sound like it's absolutely terrible. But if we put pen to paper, essentially, we have to be functioning as a regular real estate agent. There is I'm not sure how many people have bought or sold a house in the past year or so. There's a 14-page document. It's entitled Working with a Realtor, and it explains in detail, and you'd go through this with any real estate agent you work with, and it deserves more time than I'm going to give it here. But essentially explains that we have a fiduciary responsibility to our client, and it leads into I'm going to represent you as a buyer, and you are agreeing to work with me. Whether or not you want to work with a real estate agent is going to depend largely on where you think you're going to be able to get a client and when they're going to get whether or not the real estate agent is getting paid by the landlord. Some of the landlords do not cooperate with real estate agents, don't pay us because they have their own in-house leasing staff. And, in that case, the real estate agent can do a number of things. They can step back and say, look, you do your own paperwork at this point in time, and I don't have to run this through, and frankly, don't have to charge. On the other side, there's going to be the landlords that are absolutely cooperating with real estate agents, and that's very simple. What you don't want to do is get into a situation of whether or not you're signing somebody into a place and then say, oh my goodness, there's a bill that's popped up we don't know about or we didn't expect to have happen. Anybody you work with has to be fairly straightforward and say, we could do this one. This is where you may have to write a check, or this is where you do not have to write a check. Sometimes with the in-house leasing offices, you can just facilitate the introduction and be done there. But when you work with a real estate agent, we're going to bring market knowledge. We have the access to the MLS people. And frankly, we've got some relationships in the past that we're going to pick up the phone and work with again. The paperwork that we have to put together and, being able to get the showings done. I've got a couple more here. I know there's a question or two that's popped up in the chat that I want to address. But should you hire a real estate agent? Well, sometimes there's limited inventory that's on the MLS that's going to be appropriate. For example, some of the companies, Dell is a great example. Metcap is another, where they don't bother to put things on the MLS. The reason they don't put them on the MLS is because if it goes on to the standard listing system, when you see it on realtor.ca and so on, they have to agree to be paying compensation. So if they're doing this all in-house, they're not going to be there. So we have to open up our searches a little bit. And these searches go to things that, frankly, anybody paying attention to this presentation right now can go and do. We can all go to viewit.ca and take a look and see if we could find some people. And some of those ones that have the in-house systems are just going to say, look, I'm not going to bother working with a real estate agent. I pay my own people. So when would you consider working with a real estate agent? Well, if you're new to the game on this, that's probably a good time to call a real estate agent. But if you've established a huge network of landlords, you may not need it. But we can always be useful for things in the periphery. I would suggest that in your group, grab a real estate agent who can be somebody there. Maybe they're involved in going out and actually looking at properties. Maybe they're not going to be looking at properties with you. They're just going to be over at the side, taking a look at some of the paperwork. But there's going to be things that we can find through our pasts, through our networks, and through, frankly, some of the filtering systems that we have, and the networks of agents that we have for finding specific housing needs. Accessible units are always fun because there's a number of communities that have this setup, and that's okay. There's a number of communities that are set up to help people with accessible housing needs, but the specifics of barrier-free housing gets really, really different depending on how people require barrier-free stuff. A great example is I have a client of mine who is in a power wheelchair. He's a quadriplegic, and we were out looking for properties, and most of the properties that we saw that were listed as barrier-free were not suitable without significant modifications to them. But there's different levels and different stuff, and a lot of real estate agents have experience going through and finding this stuff.
Don, I'll give you the 5-minute warning.
Okay, perfect. I think I've gone ahead of myself, and I'm going to go with a couple questions that have popped up in here. Where, again, how we get paid? Well, hopefully the landlord comes up with the money for us. If not, for example, if we were to go with I'm going to pop up the chat screen. Sorry here. Okay. One of the questions came through. Who pays the real estate agent's fee, the tenant or the landlord? Most of the time, the landlord will pay the real estate agent's fee. And it's typically 1/2 of 1 month's rent. Typically, if I'm going to put a property on the MLS for rent, I'm going to charge the landlord, say it's going to be 1 month's rent plus HST. And half of that goes to the agent on the other side of the transaction. And so when I'm the agent on the other side, I will typically expect to get 1/2 of 1 month's rent, which goes into my office on that. So that's typically the amount. If we were signing an agreement to go out and search for a property, and I were signing a tenant representation agreement, it would say if I'm doing the job and filling all of this out, I would be paid 1/2 of 1 month's rent to answer that. Now, I'd like to answer two others. Should the sponsor groups be given flexible to a larger deposit, such as 6 months or even a full year? That's an excellent question. The landlord cannot ask for you to provide multiple months of rent up front. We can offer it, but it cannot be asked for. So sometimes when we see it in a lease agreement, we'll see words that say things like it's understood and agreed that the tenant came up and offered 6 months rent in advance. That can be done. I've had clients pay 1 year in advance. Some landlords do not necessarily like that. One of my landlords has rejected that because he said, well, I don't want to collect, $36,000 a month right now because this is being held in a numbered company and my year end is in 60 days. I don't want to deal with that as my income this year. The question as to whether or not that could be staggered at all, that's not my expertise. I would have to say that that goes to an accountant on that one. And one other question here before I go through the last couple slides. Do I have names of any large property landlords in the GTA who have experience with refugee groups? That's interesting. There's different avenues to get into a lot of these places. And we talked about the relationships, and Cecilia talked about the relationships. I had one a few years ago where my contact through a large rental firm said, no, we're not going to be able to put this one together. But another community group did have a different contact within that same building, like the same building, and was able to place the family into that just because they had a different person who had a different appreciation for the situation and who was sympathetic to the cause. The other challenges we face, and I'm going to really gloss over this because this goes into David's presentation quite a bit, is when we go through this, we're bringing in people who don't have necessarily a job, Canadian credit. They don't have a language skill that suggests they're going to be working next week, and these things cause a little bit of concern as far as the landlords are concerned. And one of the things that people are going to look at too is how are we going to be guaranteed our rent afterwards? Somebody had commented in here, the landlord demanded a year's rent. Yeah, that sort of stuff happens. Typically, we're going to see people put into a 1 year term for most of the rentals, especially if they're going out and paying somebody a real estate commission on these things. Though a lot of landlords I've worked with have said in the larger world, they don't want to see 1 year leases because a 1 year lease means at 10 months, people start looking at their options. But if they can move out on 60 days notice at any point in time, they'll put it off a lot longer and they have a much lower turnover of staff. Sort of turnover of their tenants in this one. And that's really going to be a landlord by landlord situation on this one. Once a 1 year lease is concluded, then it's going to go to a 60-day notice to move out anyway. So I don't know if there's really a huge advantage to any tenant to take a longer term lease than the landlord would require as their absolute bare minimum on that. That becomes a sort of a different bit of a conversation on what the tenant's rights are on this one. So here we go in a couple concluding thoughts, how sponsors and realtors can help navigate these challenges. I think this is everything that Cecilia said. If we can get character letters and community landlords where they know the people that are showing up and people who are going to be able to go and say, this is what we've got. When I put down advocate fair treatment in this, we've gone in with paperwork that says, we know these people have an income for the next year and will be able to pay their rent for the next year. But when I was 21 years old going in for an apartment in Barrie, I was still in my 90-day probation period, and my landlord was wondering whether or not I was going to be fired next month, where I very well could have been. Times have changed a little bit now. You have to come up with a little more solid footing for your landlord. So The collaboration tips, everything that Cecilia said. I probably couldn't have said anything in there better than she did as far as how you put together the package of what you're going to present to the landlord and the team of people that is going to get out there. I have on this screen a QR code. If you scan that QR code, it's just going to go to a Connect Me page. I am happy to answer questions that you have specifically on this with anything that you're going through. If you would like a copy of the residential tenancy agreement, that is a great thing to have a quick look at before you're going to be signing it. And one thing that I can offer that starts off most of the process is a rental application. The rental application for most landlords, commercial landlords, is going to be their own piece of paper, their own proprietary stuff. They've been using it since 1973. We'll ask you if you've got a Chargex card. But the basic rental application covers off who's going to be moving in, any ID stuff. If it was somebody who is already here, it'll have their driver's license number, bank information, that sort of stuff. But it starts painting the profile of who is moving in, how much money they have to spend on the monthly rent, because you don't want someone to get way out of line with their expenses. And paints a profile with some references. A lot of this stuff can work. A lot of this stuff is going to be able to work with your community, with your groups, to be able to say, even my references are going to be, here's the key people in our sponsorship group. So that might be a piece of paper to have ready to go when you find a place that seems to be awesome.
Thanks for welcoming me today. I am really glad to be here and share a few thoughts on this important part of the newcomer journey. Our goal today is to look at some simple, practical tips that will help both you and newcomers to get your sponsorship better established. We all know that finding housing is one of the biggest hurdles and most critical steps in the settlement process, especially when somebody does not yet have a credit history or Canadian income. So let's walk through what's involved and hopefully add a few new tools to our sponsor kit. All right, Gail, please go to the next slide. As sponsors, your stability and credibility are often the first thing a landlord will consider. It is important to present yourself professionally and to communicate with respect. No need to get pushy. Share stories of other successful placements that you have supported. Highlight the newcomer's strengths and reinforce your connections in the community, in the local community. These personal touches can help humanize the process and ease the landlord's concerns. Okay, Gail, sorry, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. Let's start with the basics. Most leases in Canada are for 12 months, as John presented, and usually require first and last month's rent up front. Some include utilities and some don't. It really depends on the unit and the landlord. What is important is that tenants do have rights under the provincial law, even if they have just arrived in Canada. Understanding these basics helps you support newcomers with clarity and confidence. Could we go to the next slide, please, Gail? Many newcomers face the same set of challenges. They have no credit history, no job in Canada yet, and possibly limited in their ability to speak either English or French. Landlords often rely on things like credit scores or pay stubs to make decisions. So when those are missing, as in the case of a newcomer, it's easy for a newcomer to be overlooked, even if they are reliable and capable. This is where you, as sponsors, can play a key role in helping build trust. We move to the next slide, please, Carol, or Gail, sorry. Let's talk about what landlords typically ask for. They would like credit reports, letters of employment, bank statements, and personal references. These are all standard. These documents give landlords a sense of a person's reliability. But most newcomers just won't have them yet. In their absence, some landlords seek guarantor or cosigner endorsement. So part of our role is finding ways to offer reassurance in other forms. We go to the next slide, please, Gail. So as I was saying, sometimes the landlords ask for a guarantor. Now, this is someone who signs on to be responsible for rent or damages if the tenant can't pay, essentially co-signing the lease. It is not just a verbal promise, it is a legal commitment, often for the full lease term. So while it can be a generous act, it's not a decision to be made lightly. If you do become a guarantor, you'll be legally responsible for rent or damages. Make sure your sponsor group agrees on this commitment and is backing you. It's also smart to plan for when your formal sponsorship ends. Try to clarify how you can exit the guarantor role without putting the family's housing at risk. We move to the next slide, please, Gail. If you're considering being a guarantor, it's important to think through the risks. You could be on the hook for unpaid rent or damage, and it could affect your own credit or financial planning. It can also put stress on your relationship with the newcomer if expectations aren't clear from the start. And it will be difficult to terminate such financial agreement early. That said, there are many ways to support housing without needing to co-sign. Can we go to the next slide, please, Gail? If being a guarantor isn't right for you, and that's okay, there are other options. You can suggest offering several months' rent up front, provide reference letters, or connect with community groups who can vouch for the tenant. A clear explanation, a bit of financial assurance, and your presence go a long way toward building the trust with landlords. Can we go to the next slide, please, Gail? So let's talk about what you can do. You can help newcomers prepare a rental profile. This could include letters of support, proof of savings, or personal references. You can attend viewings with them, help explain their situation, and reassure landlords. Sometimes just showing that someone has a community behind them can make a real difference. Try to introduce landlords to newcomers early. It makes the process more personal. Even better, if you've already built relationships with landlords before the need arises. That way it's easier to negotiate and secure housing later in the process. We go to the next slide then, please, Gail. Not all lease terms are fixed. You might be able to negotiate rent slightly. Ask for utilities to be included, or arrange a later move-in date. If the landlord is worried about lack of credit, offer alternatives. Maybe a few months of prepaid rent or a letter from your organization. Again, as John outlined, landlords can't demand this, but you, as supporting your group, settlement group, can offer it. Your respectful approach and flexibility can open up options that weren't on the table before. And finally, make sure you're walking away from any exploitive situation. Can we go to the next slide, please, Gail? These are some common challenges you might encounter during lease negotiations. Landlords may be skeptical of newcomers who lack Canadian credit or job history. And as sponsors, you can help build trust by providing documents and context. Some landlords may ask for large deposits or illegal upfront amounts. And here it's key to know what is legally allowed in Ontario. Language barriers can lead to confusion about lease terms. Sponsors should clarify or translate when needed. The next point, sponsors may feel pressured to act as guarantors. As I stated before, this is a serious financial commitment and not always necessary. The next point, avoid verbal or vague lease agreements. Insist on using the Ontario Standards lease, again, as John presented. Be vigilant about scams. Verify listings, meet in person, and never send money without first seeing the unit. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please, Gail? With more rental options opening up in some cities, not everywhere, especially with fewer international students now coming, landlords may start offering incentives to attract tenants. These could be things like a free month's rent, free internet, or even gift cards, free parking. Encourage the newcomers you support to ask whether any of these are available. Or better yet, as sponsors, keep an eye out for these deals. Go to the next slide then, please, Gail. As a case example, a sponsor group went the extra mile. They wrote a strong letter of support for their settlement group, established a relationship with the landlord early, and introduced the newcomer family directly. They continued checking in after the lease was signed to make sure things were going smoothly. That kind of involvement leads to a long-term housing success. Can we move to the next slide now, please, Gail? This is going over what John had talked about, and also I think Cecilia mentioned it as well. Since 2018, Ontario landlords are required to use a standard lease form for most residential rentals. This document clearly lays out the responsibilities of both the landlord and the tenant and is available in many languages. It helps prevent misunderstandings and ensures both parties know what they're agreeing to. If the landlord doesn't use it, you can politely suggest switching to the standard form. It protects everyone. We can move to the next slide, please, Gail. So let's talk about scams for a moment. Newcomers are unfortunately more vulnerable to fraud. For example, fake listings, landlords asking for payment before a viewing, or offers that seem too good to be true. Never send money without first seeing the unit. Always verify that the landlord owns or manages the property. As a sponsor, accompany the newcomers to viewings and double check the listings come from reliable, trusted sources. Go to the next one, please, Gail. Another important area where sponsors can offer guidance is around rent increases. In Ontario, landlords can only raise rent once every 12 months, generally speaking. And they must give at least 90 days written notice using a specific form called the N1. The amount that they can increase is also regulated. Each year, the province sets a maximum allowable percentage. For example, in 2024, it was 2.5%. Most units are covered under rent control, especially if they were occupied before November 15th, 2018. However, some newer buildings are exempt from these limits. It's really important for tenants and you as sponsors to double check the rules that apply to the specific rental unit that you're looking at. If a landlord increases rent unlawfully or doesn't provide proper notice, tenants can file a complaint with the Landlord and Tenant Board. Sponsors can help by reviewing any notices the tenant receives and supporting them in understanding what their rights are. And finally, if we move to the next slide, please, Gail. That brings us to the end. I hope that this gives you some useful strategies and confidence to help the newcomers you support find safe and stable housing. Whether it's reviewing a lease, attending a viewing, or providing a support letter, you're making a meaningful difference. There are resources listed in the following slide and here that to help you go further. And thank you again for everything you do. Remember, this process is about more than just securing a unit. It's about building trust and stability. Use your networks, help newcomers understand their rights, and gradually support them towards independence. That is the ultimate goal. And in conclusion, the last slide here provides you with links to some of the resources that you may find helpful. Thank you all very much.